And what you're often dealing with there is this question for everybody. Should I, as a developer, provide what people want but can't afford, or should I provide what they can afford but don't want?
Welcome to Dirt NC, where we talk all about the places and spaces of North Carolina and the people who make them awesome. I'm your host, Jed Byrne. Throughout my career in real estate development, finance, commercial brokerage, engineering, and construction, I have covered just about all facets of the real estate and land use ecosystem. This show is an opportunity to not only share what I've learned with you, but to also introduce you to my friends who are doing truly transformative work and sharing their stories. With each episode of Dirt NC, my goal is simple. I want you to walk away learning something new about land use. I promise to keep it simple and straight to the point. If you ever have any questions for me, feel free to reach out on Twitter at OakCityCRE. Now let's jump in. Today I have the privilege of speaking with Ben Stevens, who is a development manager for CoLiving in Raleigh, working on projects across the Carolinas. CoLiving is a real estate development firm with a nationwide platform focusing on multifamily and senior living. He received his MBA with a focus in real estate and urban land economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the creator of the Skyline Forum, an online interview series with developers, architects, and urban planners. And you can find him at his personal website, on Twitter, and LinkedIn. I'll include all of the links for Ben in the show notes below. Today, we get to talk about all sorts of things. Ben is the author of a fantastic book called The Birth of a Building, which is really a great insight into the process of development, and he goes about it through the lens of someone who truly is a beginner. In our interview, we talk about what is beginner's mind and why that's important, why he was the right person to write this book when he was fresh out of school and hadn't yet had the years of development experience that he now has. We'll talk about why development is like a symphony, but a symphony with no music that's being written in process. We'll talk about the tension of information management. And through all this, you'll get a behind-the-scenes look at the development process and learn more about the process from a professional who truly knows what it's like to be a beginner. And I think there really is no better way to write and teach others about this process.
My name is Ben. I live here in Raleigh and work as a development manager for a national multifamily development firm. And married, as we just alluded to Rebecca, father of two, and a big fan of this podcast. So yeah, I think that's the basic bio. Moved here about a year ago from Chicago. I've had a series of different jobs in development. Got into development when I was about 30, had been in the nonprofit world, and so that's the backstory, I suppose, in a nutshell.
And so when you go someplace new, how do you introduce yourself to folks, strangers in a room?
I guess it depends on who the strangers are. But I would just say that if it was about my job, a lot of people haven't encountered the word developer. They don't know what that means, or they think it's a software person. But a developer is somebody who finds a piece of land or is involved in the finding of a piece of land and hires an architect and hires a contractor, and they then hire all their associated, consultants, and you basically shepherd the whole creation of a brand new building from the very beginning to the very end, when you sell it or hold on to it. But I also, personally, I enjoy writing, which is kind of, I think, what led to this conversation. So write whenever I can, and just have numerous different interests that, and actually when I was looking to maybe pivot a bit in my career, was kind of thinking about what is something that I could do that's relatively interdisciplinary. And, I looked at graphic design, I looked at a bunch of different things that I might go into, and landed on development because I thought that it would give me an opportunity to kind of be at the intersection of a bunch of different things. And that's honestly its promise and its peril, because anyway, we can talk about that.
Well, I think, again, we've known each other for a handful of years, and one of the things that's always impressed me is how you seemingly have all these different skills that weren't crafted necessarily in or for development, but come in handy, right? The graphic design, the writing, all these different things,
right.
Architecture, study of, design and buildings and places that you've been to really do kind of come together in a confluence in development, which I think is kind of the interesting thing. But you're a development manager. How did you get into you mentioned going from nonprofit to development, but what was that transition kind of like for you?
Well, so I lived in Germany for a real long time, and I say real long time. I lived in Germany for about 5 years, and was doing nonprofit work there, and befriended. This is kind of when all the influx of refugees was happening in Germany during the Syrian crisis. Anyway, was doing some kind of work on the side in one of these big, pop-up shelters, which was a fascinating structure in its own right. They go to a football field and put this like blow up dome kind of thing, and this is where people who were like their first night in Germany is in this thing. And anyway, so it was just down the street from us, so I was like helping with the breakfast crew there. There's an architect who had his studio just up the street. We got to be good friends, and he introduced me to all the kind of Berlin architecture scene and some urban planners there, and I actually nearly matriculated at the TU in Berlin, which is a great architecture program. And but I kind of just got convinced that, just given my Myers-Briggs and whatever, that it might be more interesting if I pursued the interest that I still maintain in all those different fields on the side of development, for better or for worse. And so that's kind of how that transition happened. We moved back to the U.S., did my MBA at Wisconsin. My wife is from Wisconsin, not Missouri. So, so then I went to Wisconsin. I graduated and took a job at a firm in Madison, was there for a couple of years, and they were doing a bunch of different stuff, lots of different asset classes. And so that was some interesting exposure. And then after a couple of years there, I transitioned to a firm in Chicago doing affordable subsidized housing. So with tax credits, we did some public housing renovation. We looked at some homeless housing, really a wide gamut. And actually, I was pursuing an RFP in Durham that I got second place on. And in the course of that process, met some people at the firm that won. It was a joint venture between an affordable firm and a market rate firm. And met some people through that, and actually ended up working with one of them. And I'm going to close in a couple of months on the project, which I got second place on in that RFP. So never give up.
Yeah, it's come full circle. And that's, again, we've known each other for years, and we'll talk a bit more about Raleigh hopefully later on in the interview. But this is a place that the Triangle is a place that you've wanted to be. And
that's right.
As a fairly newcomer, I've been here for almost 10 years. It's amazing to me how many people I come across who have done some sort of analysis and said, this is where I want to be. And then they'll move without a job or just pay really close attention for a long time. So, again, I think the Triangle and North Carolina as a whole is an exciting place. And it's always impressive to me, the people, because I kind of just wound up here, but it's always impressive and interesting to me to know that there are people out there who make it a strategic point to say, like, that's where I want to be. And again, especially given your kind of roundabout path to where you are, both professionally and geographically, it's interesting. So looking back, was it Wisconsin that gave you the kind of development bug, or what was your first memory or favorite first memory of a built environment experience?
I think that the quality of the construction and engineering in Germany is kind of where it started. Now they build things to an almost prohibitive standard. You can engineer something so well that it's not economically feasible. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, having seen what they do, whether it's like in these guest house, the house we lived in an apartment from the 1850s, in Berlin. The back had been bombed out, but the building we were in was still around. And I was just fascinated by that, fascinated by Berlin's history, and was fascinated by the impact of this is kind of cliche, but the impact those spaces have on you. So I think that's where it started. And the development bug, I don't know if it was really a pull. In some senses, it was more of a push. I actually met with a really great guy who had been doing a lot of planning, consulting, and actually he was on the municipal side. And he had come up with some really great plans, some form-based codes, and I'd actually taken one of his courses online. And so I just reached out to him, and for no obvious reason, he took the call, and we had a real nice chat. and I was talking about what I wanted to do. And at the time, I was really on the fence between a few of these different disciplines, which each touch on the things that I was interested in. And he, I think, had an incredible amount of candor and just shared a bit about how many times his heart had been broken, like having spent a lot of time on a plan, a great plan that was really well thought through, and then to have it be politically sabotaged at the last moment, or to have it, all these different intrigues that were kind of out of his control. And, you know, it was really interesting because, I mean, I could have also talked to a developer at the time who could have told me all sorts of heartache that I didn't know was going to come with the job of development. So it wasn't exclusively that. But I think the idea of needing / being able to be in the maximally interdisciplinary position, which through a number of those conversations I came to realize is kind of what development can be, and often has to be. You're in that coordination role. I think that's where it started to make sense. But I could have been, I think the coordination kind of juggling skill set is probably the one I have more so than design. One of my very best friends is a great architect, and he was actually thinking about development, and I'd like to think I talked him out of it because I said, you're too good of a designer to start, stay in the skill set that you've got. And he brings a tremendous amount of value to that. I hope I bring value in the development role. So it was a tight race between a few different fields, and that's kind of just how it shook out my personality.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it a little bit beforehand too, but this kind of idea of, as the developer, you're the quarterback or you're the hub of the spoke. And so, for better or worse, you have your skills and you supplement your skills with a team of experts around you. And you do, I think, have a lot of the control, but there's also, there's regulatory stuff that you can't change. There's market stuff that you can't change. There's physical, gravity, right? Like there's physical, the laws of physics that you can't change, but you're working in the midst of all of that, which again, right, is what attracted me to development and spaces and places. And right, I don't think it's cliche at all. I think there's something very powerful about being somewhere. Even in this office, right? Somebody had a vision, somebody had resources and assets and brought these ideas and resources together to create this space that's, I don't even know. I guess it's been here for 100 years.
Right.
And in your case, in Germany and other places, for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And no one can foresee what the future is going to hold. But I do think that's the power of real estate and, I guess, just place.
Well, and one of the metaphors that did not make it into the book, but is going to be a part of some stuff in the future, is looking. So people will often say the developer is the director of the symphony or something. I think that's actually, now that I know the day-to-day even better than I did when I wrote the book, it's totally inadequate, because a conductor and the orchestra have music that was written by Brahms 170 years ago, right? It's there. It even says how loud to play it. And in the case of a new building project, there is no music. And there's a group of composers, not just one. There's a clarinet composer who writes for the clarinetist, or whatever you call somebody who plays the clarinet. And there's a oboe composer who writes for the person who plays the oboe. So like mechanical engineer, electrical engineer. But they're not even going to be the ones who perform it. Right. And so they're going to give that sheet music they have to, the electrician, who is then going to go make shop drawings of it. And we don't see what it all is until we sit down to play it for the first time, and only time.
Yeah.
It's never going to be played again anywhere else in quite the same way. And so that need to somehow keep a handle on what every different drawing, there's the design stage, then there's the person who implements it, and there's the shop drawing, and there's the final product. And it's, you can nail the vision at one stage and totally lose it in the next stage. And so that's, I think, the stressful part.
Well, and that's, you brought up again offline this idea, somewhere in here, but about tension, right? So I think a lot, and it's not my quote, but it's there's a difference between a problem to be solved and a tension to be managed. And I do think a lot of what goes on in the development realm is tensions, right? So you can make sure you spend maximal time with each of your different consultants and each of the different team members. But if you do that too much, the pre-development process takes 20 years and
Right.
you never get a deal done because
That's right.
no investor, wants to wait that long, or the market can't wait that long, or there's
That's
just
right.
so there is no, and so you want to, okay, so spend less time, but if you spend
Yep.
not enough time, then you run into these problems. And then again, you can say, okay, well, I won't worry about problems because I can build in contingency and have financial cushion. So if and when we hit a problem, but if you build
Definitely
too much financial,
not my preferred
right,
route
but
to
it
solve.
even still, there's if you have too much contingency and too much cushion, then the deal doesn't pencil. And so it can't, so there's all of these
That's exactly
tensions that are always being managed. And I think there are problems you can solve. But again, to your point, that each deal,
Yep.
even if you're building an apartment community,
Right.
each deal is going to be different in several, if not most, aspects.
That's right.
And so anyway, it's a fascinating industry. One that, I mean, has taken you right to your point about writing the book. I mean, you not only care enough about it to do it for a living,
Mhm.
you've also written this book, Birth of a Building, which, I've got sitting on my bookshelf somewhere down there. I promise you it's there. I'll show you before you leave. But it's this idea. So I think we know kind of where the book came from, but why do you think it needed to be written?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing that I would say is that it's funny to look back, because I was arguably the worst person to write a book. I started writing it.
Why do you say that?
Well, I started writing this book the first semester after I graduated from my MBA, in the midst of absolutely zero actual practical experience, right?
Mm.
So why would I do that? And so part of it was just, it was a project that I could control, that it was fun. I had written before in my previous life, and gave me a systematic way to kind of approach, the continuing learning process. But there is a weird dynamic when you're trying to teach. There's two things you have to have. You have to understand the subject.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand the audience. And those kind of move in an inverse relationship to each other, because the audience is people who don't have a clue.
Mm-hmm.
And and I was very familiar with the ins and outs of not having a clue. And the subject matter is something that you gain over, many years, decades of experience.
Yeah.
And so not infrequently, the people who are tapped, and for perfectly good reason, to write on any given topic have a tremendous amount of understanding of the subject, but in some weird Peter Pan way, they have totally forgotten what it was like to not have a clue. And so they just don't even know what chapter to start on.
Yeah.
And they'll start on the equivalent of chapter 7. I'm reading a book, Intro to Stats, the other day, and it's like, and for this we use a logarithmic function. Like, well, what is a logarithmic function?
Yeah.
They just start way down the road, right? And so I think the thing that I was an expert on was not having a clue, and I was able to then just reach out to different people I knew and who were experts, and that's something, for example, that Michael Pollan does really well in A Place of My Own, other books like that. He starts from the premise that he doesn't have a clue. It's self-deprecating. It makes it accessible.
Yeah.
And then he reads all the experts and talks to the right people. And it's journalistic. So that's what the book was. And so that's kind of how it happened.
Well, I mean, I do think that's right. It's you had that beginner's mind, and so you knew, okay, well, here are the questions I have. And again, for an audience where it's an educational book about the development process,
right,
you more so than anybody know what the questions are, know what the hangups are, and
right.
I mean, you and I have definitely been in conversations that I'm sure would make people's eyes roll back on something that they're interested in, but because we're just talking using acronyms
right.
and using professional language that people don't understand. And so again, that's been part of why I enjoy doing these interviews. Is I get out kind of on the limb and I
right.
talk to people. I know nothing about writing a book. I know a little bit about development. I know a little bit about real estate, but there's all sorts of things that I have no idea about. And my hope is that in having these conversations, this is a way for other people who don't know about these things to learn and hear and absorb that information, because a lot of times, right, the experts can tend to skip past their audience. And if you do that, your audience shrinks and you miss a lot of opportunity.
That's right.
So hopefully we can keep from doing that. But so the book is about the kind of development process, and I think you break it down in a really unique way. And you hinted at this a little bit, but I mean, is the book for, who's the book for? Is it beginners in the real estate development industry? Is it students? Is it lay people?
I'd like to think, and I talk about in the preface, that it's an interdisciplinary intro to, before you specialize in real estate finance or architecture or landscape architecture or urban planning or whatever it is you're specializing in, it's great to have an understanding of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a perfect introduction to the whole, but I was trying to be interdisciplinary. It's in use at schools in a bunch of those different topics, and so I do think that I did try to cater to the university crowd, the freshman or the incoming graduate student who doesn't know a lot about this. But I think there's plenty of other people hospital administrator who they're building a new wing of the building or something, and it's just not their job to be a real estate developer, but they need a passing familiarity with it. Or you're in a nonprofit and there's a building project or something, and you want to be a bit more informed. So I think that in the course of a person's life, for one reason or another, a lot of people are required to be involved in some concentric circle of the process.
Right.
And so I think as a secondary audience that it's being well received by that group.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, real estate, again, I think the pool of developers is fairly small amongst the general population, but everybody is impacted by the built environment.
That's right.
Almost constantly every single day, right? You're in the office, you're in the restaurant, you're at home, you're in the park, you're on the street. I mean, I don't know where you go to escape. I mean, the desert in Africa, it's still, it's an abandoned city, but it's a city nonetheless. And again, it amazes to me. I can't think of a group of people who, like you said, if not today, at some point in their life, are going to benefit from a better understanding of the process of development. So if you can you frame in, what is that process, and how do you kind of think about it at a high level, and how did you deliver that, pun intended, in the book?
Right. Well, that's an allusion to this metaphor that I use, where part one is the birds and the bees, where I kind of explain historically why are we doing this in the first place, and part two is pregnancy and delivery. And speaking kind of in the broadest terms, there's the meta questions, like what capacity does a given person or a given firm have? What size project can they do? What do they have the expertise in? What sort of a building are they, like, for what sort of user are they doing this? Is it to develop it and sell it to somebody? Is it to develop it and own it and then be a asset manager, a long-term property owner? Where do you see the opportunity? Which markets? There's all those meta questions which you kind of have to sit down and decide on from a strategic perspective. What are we about? What am I about? What are we attempting to do? And downstream of that, there are really these two components. I'm not sure this is how I necessarily framed it in the book, but it's certainly how it kind of presents itself to my mind these days, is that so much of the things that you're doing are downstream of the site, especially in North Carolina, where there's incredible, the site will drop 30 feet across the site and it's buffered by this and that. So much of what you're doing is determined by the site. And so I'm leaving this meeting to go look at two sites. Finding a site and saying, given what I want to do here, am I going to be able to get in a car with investors and drive here or walk here or take the bus or whatever, and plausibly tell the story of why this building should go here and why it's going to be financially viable? And that is going to be predicated upon the question of whether I'm going to be able to take the eventual users to that space and say, this is the space, this is what it offers you, this is what it costs, and that they're going to say, yes, I'd like to be here, and sign. Yes, I'd like to be here for this price, and yes, I will pick you over this competition for XYZ reason. All those stories have to work, and that's totally bound up with the site. Where is it? When is it? What is it? So then you have the process where you say, okay, we think that this site could be the home for this new project.
Yeah.
And you get into the pregnancy and delivery stage, where you're doing 10 different sorts of evaluation to ensure that this is the thing that you have in your mind that you've projected onto it. Are the soils okay? Does it drain okay? Is there nuclear waste buried here, et cetera, et cetera? You have to get a handle on what the city will allow, how much flexibility there is if you're doing something that is different than what they have in mind. You have to have, I mean, very early a rough concept of what could fit on the site, what sort of density you could achieve. You also have to look at, how will we make this appealing, in the process of that density. Gosh, it goes on and on. And then I referenced that metaphor from earlier about the symphony. Then you just start, 50 people start composing music, and then somebody else, is going to go play it, and you have 6 to 18 months to make sure that process, once we get out there and somebody raises the wand and they start playing, that it's going to be harmonious and not some kind of a Leonard Bernstein situation. So that's, I guess, in the broadest sense, how I would characterize the process. Happy to dive in on any particular aspect. It's the process is a lot more even than what I foreshadow what I unpack in the book. I mean, there's 4 pages on structural engineering, and suffice it to say, I didn't exhaust the topic, right? So the book kind of whets your appetite or gives you a basic familiarity with all those things, but each of them is its own discipline.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert in any of them. I'm an expert or trying to become an expert in the coordination of them.
But it, again, in the book, to me, the helpful thing is even someone who's taken graduate level courses and has been in the industry, is you do kind of walk through the whole process, and I think it sheds the light on all the different aspects and pieces, all the different risks, all the different ways to think. Because again, when you're talking early days, is you're getting together either as a sole proprietor or as part of an organization, and a bunch of questions have to come into focus and answers have to be seen before you can even develop a strategy of hey, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to deliver multifamily, single family, for sale, for rent, commercial, parks? I mean, there's the public sector, there's all these different things.
That's right.
And when you talked about bringing investors or partners or tenants or users past the site, I mean, again, you talked about what a piece of dirt can support or hold. I mean, dirt, for all intents and purposes, is very similar in Manhattan, and Raleigh, and so you're right, it could support 100-story structure, but can the market support that? Can you get it financed? There's all these different, and so I think that analogy of the symphony with no music is fantastic, because right, you look at a piece of property, whether it's greenfield or has been built upon already, and it's up to you as the developer or as the team to cast a vision, to come up with something that can work. And while there are plenty of constraints and plenty of things that are going to say this can't work, the opportunities are almost endless. I mean, right, you're building a space, and so 4 walls and a roof can be used in all sorts of different manners. And so it's a fascinating thing, and I do think you go through extremely well in the book what all that entails, and there's enough detail for everybody to say, okay, well, there's you mentioned structural engineering. Okay, well, if I have more questions, well, I can call, or my friend's cousin is a structural engineer, I can talk to them at the party next time I see them about when we have parties for what further questions I have. But again, I think most people don't fully understand all the different avenues of the process and all the different
well, it's funny because
bits and pieces.
I find myself already now, like, I'm not sure I could write that exact book right now, because I've already kind of moved on from some of the questions that I had then. And what I kind of am layering on top of all that right now in what I'm thinking and writing are some of the things that are a bit more developer specific. So like sequencing is half of the ballgame. Like, what is the most important thing to do right now, and everything else has to wait because there's so many steps. If I get sidetracked on some minutia, it's also, I've just noticed, like, if you are in a group of professionals, design professionals or construction professionals or whatever, a major thing which I'm personally attempting to work on and refine is just knowing what questions to ask when, because it's a sign of a total noob. When you ask this question, it's like, man, we're not going to even be in a position to talk about that for like 4 months. and to spend time on it right now, we can't really, come down one way or the other in that question. But the other thing that is so critical, and also from my perspective a bit nerve-wracking, is information management. There are so many things that can make a development not work, that you have, and one of the implications of all these different people being involved is, you think they really don't know the other field, right? I'm spending time to learn about all these topics because I have to kind of have a C+ in all of them. But there are things about a site or a building or a leasing situation or whatever it is, that if so and so else who's on the team knew that, it would like fill the field of their imagination, and they would think, gosh, everything has to stop. To which was like, I have to manage that information. And there's also so many times in a project something that could kill it, but I don't know if it's going to kill it or not. And there's really no value. As long as people are getting paid and as long as we're all acting like, there is no value in sharing that right now, because so many of those things are going to pass away and come to nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this weird thing that I've noticed, like, I kind of have to be the vault for that. Not undersharing, because it requires collaboration. Right. It is a huge problem. I think I was previously inclined to overshare, and that feels like, oh, I'm helping everybody. But you're adding stuff that it's not in their scope. It's not their job to solve that problem. It's my job. And it distracts them from thinking like, maybe this isn't going anywhere.
Right.
But there is conversely people who just do, like, you don't know anything about what's going on. And I have yet to meet the person who embodies the perfect balance between those. But that I'm personally finding
it's a big struggle. And
having the right size vault for all that information, to use a civil engineering metaphor, is super complex and nerve-wracking for me. That's
Well, you talked about sequencing as one aspect, but like how given that these projects, right, you talked about in the book, right? So Birth of a Building, right? This is a 9 or roughly year-long, 9-month process. Well, the birth of a building could be 10 years. I'm sure you've heard of projects that are 10, 15, 20 years in the making. And so how are you learning all this sequencing, and how are you learning? When it's, I think iteration is the answer, but if you're iterating on every project, mm-hmm. you'll get, 12 cycles in your career. So how are you?
Well, the same way that you do, I talk to a lot of people. When I find a consultant, or when I find a construction professional, or somebody who I respect a lot, or a development professional, whoever, financier, who I respect a lot, and in particular who I know spends a lot of time with other people who I really, other of my peers, mm-hmm. who are at the very top of their field, I'll just ask. I have to be careful, because again, it goes back to information management, sequencing. Like, I have to keep a certain amount of control over the process, and I can't walk into the room with 20 consultants and say, what do you guys think we should do? Because that's not right. There's a certain balance of that, but nonetheless, and they don't want that responsibility. But I do take the time to the greatest extent possible to, I'll just kind of jokingly say, hey, this is not for the project, but it's Ben's continuing education. Why can't you put a building on top of a precast deck? And they'll give me the 5-minute explanation. And you find yourself constantly in the presence of people who, whether it's a technical topic or whether it's the process, which is what you're talking about, have either themselves, led it well, or have just seen a real expert who was just apparent. This mm-hmm. person is a master of this process, and just one way or the other will attempt to discern, like, when did they do this and when did they do that?
Yeah.
And you pick off different parts of it, and it's not anything all at once. But
and again, I think back to the original, this idea of tension in a project, and everybody, nobody gets it perfect. And so when you talk to people, and I think fortunately, at least around here, people are very willing to share their scars and bruises, mm-hmm. and where things have gone wrong, because everyone's got war stories. And
right.
While no project is identical, I do think things and themes repeat. And so it's talking to people again. That's why we're here. It's fun for me to talk to people, and you learn, or I learn through talking. Right. So in that regard, I mean, so you've written a book, you've published a book. I mean, what was that process like? What did you learn? What was something that surprised you in the process of either writing this book specifically or in general?
Yeah,
being an author.
Surprising, which shouldn't be based on everything I've already explained about the circumstances under which I wrote it, was that I was surprised how little that I knew, even though I just did the master's and had done some internships and so on. And I think that that's not uncommon when you go to Wall Street and ask somebody, do you know how people should price options? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, of course I know how to price options. Like, what's the equation? Like, give me the 7 steps. It's very humbling to say, I'm going to write this down and I'm going to put it out there, and professionals who know an order of magnitude about the subject than I do are going to get asked, like, hey, Jeff, is this accurate? And so it just really, makes you examine things. So that was surprising, although it absolutely should not have been. The writing process. So I'd actually done a book before, and it was through a more traditional, where you write a book proposal, and then you get an agent, and then you get a contract, and it was a long process, and I was not a huge fan of those other things. And in this case, I was fresh out of the context. I knew the books that were out there, and I thought that I could at least complement what was out there. And I had also done a lot of public speaking at the time, and so I just put some thought into how you hold attention, maybe not on display in my conversation today, but anyway, I had given a lot of thought to that and studied that, and was able to discern. One of my major theses in writing the book and in everything is that a lot of what people say is creative unction or total inspiration. If you can't boil down the exact steps, you can nonetheless define what their creative process is, the process that they go through to get there. Frank Lloyd Wright built 1,000 houses. I don't think it was total new inspiration every time, right? He has a process. And so I'm always trying to understand the process. In this case, I don't have chapters that are more than 1,500 words. I don't have sentences that are longer than about 25 words. Paragraphs are 140. There's certain rules that if you stay within them, it has a tremendous impact on readability, and so it was interesting to kind of refine those and learn some of those, and also put into practice some things. So, for example, there's a guy I know who taught me that there's 3 kinds of analogies. The first is one in which you've experienced it and the audience has experienced it, and that's the best, because you start explaining it and they go right to when it happened to them. The second kind is you've experienced it and they haven't, but at least it's your story, right? You went camping with your dad and this happened. And the third kind is you saw this movie, and maybe they saw it too, but it didn't happen to you. It didn't really happen to them. It's this external thing, and it's better than nothing, but it doesn't grip you in the same way. Yeah. And so learning to find ways that the process of development, whether it's site due diligence or whatever, does have an analogy in life, and that very few things are so totally esoteric that there's no analogy for them. That was a great learning process for me, to just review those things and put some of those previous lessons into practice.
Well, it is interesting. We talked, in building and development, everything's unique and every project is unique, but there definitely are kind of creative scaffolding and structures that exist. And it's so much of what I've seen, and back to the experts, either in their specific fields or on the development side, there's hunches and intuitions and just rules of thumb and different things that you can say, okay, well, it's got to be this certain way, or it's got to be within these realms and inside this kind of scaffolding that makes it work. And I do think when you have a good understanding of that, it allows you back, I guess, also to that information control. It allows you to kind of block out everything else and say, okay, well, we know that the building is going to be situated here. We know that you can't build on top of the precast deck. We know that people need X amount of living space and X amount of, amenity space and X amount of outdoor space and indoor space, and the pool should have this many, square feet of
Right.
seating area per size of. I mean, there's just all these kind of not rules, but there's a lot of structure to it and a lot of criteria that are kind of set in place over millennia. And you actually had given me the recommendation years ago. There it is right there. A Pattern Language is another book.
That's right.
That, again, you don't think about it. And I think a lot of people who aren't in the business every day maybe not be able to put words to it, but as you realize it, okay, so there's certain things that just make a room feel good. And there's a certain criteria that make it feel bad or make it not work. And so again, if you can work sharply within those criteria and inside that framework, I think you can concentrate on being creative and delivering something new and unique. But again, to your point about Frank Lloyd Wright, it's not starting from scratch every time.
That's right.
But you can really hit the ball out of the park when you're aware of your surroundings. So that's as you've come along, my sense is, like most people in the development world, you get a sense that even though the built environment is something that everybody engages with on a daily basis, and maybe because the pool of developers is small, developer is kind of not necessarily, unless you're talking about the technical kind, but real estate developers aren't always seen in the best light. And so how do you think about the tensions that presents? And I know you and I think probably struggle with similar tensions, but where do you come out? I mean, have your thought processes or thoughts about those tensions changed over time?
Mm-hmm.
Or what are kind of the tensions that you now, as a developer, are struggling with? So
I was driving around this weekend actually with a real good friend of mine in a town that's had a lot of growth, and we were talking through a few of these sorts of questions. Like, why are they building so much right now? And I said, well, it's a lot of people moving here, and they kind of have to live somewhere, and in fact, we haven't built nearly enough. So that's its own topic. But I think you can bring people around to understanding that, yes, just like you have to have a place to live, and buildings age and they have to be replaced. It's just a big task, right? Housing 300 plus million people. So, okay. And then there's the question, yeah, but why isn't it nicer? Like, I don't really like this building, to which I always say, like, well, why don't you drive an Italian supercar? I mean, if you went to a public meeting and you complain that there's just Honda Civics out in the parking lot, I think people would just be like, how dare you, demand that I live at a certain standard? But that's exactly the tension that developers have. Of course, we can build anything you want, but I have to be able to lease it. Mm-hmm. And that's another tension. If I make it so that it's so incredibly luxurious that only the 1% can live there, that's another critique. So you're kind of caught there. And I think if pressed, people understand that it's a product, just like Honda Civic is a product, and we have to meet a certain market. The thing that I personally struggle with in development is not really unique to development. It's just really a business thing. And I give the example, if somebody creates a restaurant that's really top notch, mm-hmm. and they have the instinct, I should do another one of these. I want more people to have this experience. And they do 5, and then they do 20, and then they do 500. And a bunch of other people have the same instinct. Man, I made something really great here. Other people should have the chance to experience this. I mean, it's the same thing that car manufacturers have 7 models. They're not doing a bespoke car for every person, right? But the instinct to say, I have this good thing, and I want to replicate it all over the place because it's efficient. I've already done it once. Why not just replicate that? Why do I need to make 20 new things? Under the rubric of efficiency, there's a lot right now that is driven, understandably, it's a good thing. Efficiency is a good thing. I mean, I'm doing an online course right now that I'm just finished filming. And the good thing about it is people can watch it whenever they want. They can watch it over and over and over and over. And I don't know that I would want to teach it over and over and over and over and over. So that's good. But then I don't meet those people. Mm-hmm. I don't meet most of them. I don't have those memories. And, we're not computers in the sense, like, computers wouldn't talk. They can make decisions and communicate, with shots of electricity in milliseconds, and we just are not set up for that. So the thing that I struggle with, I suppose, the tension, as I say, it's not inherent in development, it's inherent in business, is that many of the things that we're trying to do are becoming what they are to fit certain parameters of business efficiency. So and so wants to write a check that's this big, so we need to make the building this big, and we can't do stuff that's not that big.
So talk about for a second that, I mean, on the finance side. So there are, when you say why would somebody care about, all else being equal, yes, if you're a company and you're worried about return of your investment, why would somebody care about, is this a $1 check, $100 million check, a $10 million? Why would it matter as an investor, the size? Why do they even think about the size of investment?
I guess what's the good bespoke analogy? It's just very difficult to keep track of, if I think the reason that things like index funds and mutual funds were popular is because you could keep track of it kind of all in one spot, whereas the average person does not want to have 500 different investments which they have to check up on. That's just efficiency. They want to look at it for a few minutes a day and move on. That's the same reason that investors want to write big checks and have big projects, so that they have to fly to 5 cities and not 50 cities to examine how process is going. It's a natural, good, understandable.
It's kind of the economies of scale.
It's economies of scale, exactly. And so, unfortunately, or at least from my perspective, I can drive around with my friend and explain economies of scale, but I still don't like landing in some town, and it's every town, because every business that works well has also put its location in that city. And we can look at that and say that, this is soulless and we don't like it. And it kind of is soulless. But I'm not able to then go back and say, like, so, Sally, who had this amazing restaurant, shouldn't do another one. I mean, she put all this work into this great restaurant. And so I just really struggle. Now, to be fair to developers, if I may take their side, I'd say what we do is about as bespoke as anything, right? In a building, even if people say it looks like all the other buildings, is at least as different from the other buildings as those other products that are for sale. But I do struggle with that, and knowing how not to be constrained and just entirely limited by whatever the absolute economy of scale is. Like, it's kind of a business imperative, but there are things that are business imperatives that are nonetheless not very pleasant and don't create the sorts of spaces that I want to go on vacation to. And I find that a real tension. It's just business wide.
Well, that's, I mean, the funny thing, and I was talking to somebody about this earlier today, is, unlike the car analogy, right? I have no say in what Toyota does with their production lines. I mean, I can buy a Toyota, and I do own a Toyota for what it's worth. But I don't go to a meeting at the board and say, hey, real quick, I get 2 minutes to speak about what you're building. I like it. I don't like it. You should do this. You should do that.
Right.
Real estate in the built environment has, for better and worse, has a lot of public input, and I do believe there's externalities with it. Similar to the car. I mean, what Toyota does has positive and negative externalities, but we have positive and negative externalities on the community, and so you get all this public input. But I'm a firm believer, which I think is where a lot of this tension lies. I mean, right, as you drive around with your friends, you as a public citizen have commentary and have ideas about what other people have built before you move to Raleigh or before you move to wherever you live, right. Germany and here. So you have this, I guess, input and thoughts on the matter. But there's also this whole idea that you're not in control, and the systems, I think my current thesis, and it's not my thesis, but my current thinking is, like, our systems produce what they're designed to produce. And so I hear plenty of conversations about, well, you're on restaurants, you're just getting the national brands who can pay higher rents and can be on Main Street and can afford this and can afford that and can duplicate and produce 1,000 different restaurants a year. Right. And I want smaller restaurants. I want mom and pop shops, and those are going away. Well, our systems have been set up, and I think they're producing what they're designed to produce. And we may not like what that is, but I don't think the answer is complaining about it. I hope that the answer is coming together and figuring out a way to change the system so that if you don't want, if you say, oh, well, big investors, there's foreign capital, sometimes internationally foreign, sometimes from other cities. The big New York investors coming in and writing $100 million check for a project in Raleigh, and we don't like where that's going. Well, we also don't make it easier or plausible or feasible for you and me to get together and do a project, because the only stuff that can get built, the only stuff that's feasible, is extremely expensive and large projects, then I can't play in that arena. You can't play in that arena. Most people cannot. And so if the only investment that gets made is the $100 million checks, there's only so many people that can write those, and they're probably not around here. So I do think that's part of the conversation I want to advance, is how can we rethink about these systems, and in a world where we can't fix the problems, where we're only managing the tensions, how do we manage those tensions in a direction that we as a community want? And again, given the way the process currently works, I think it's often very contentious and doesn't need to be. But that's maybe a conversation for a different story. So kind of lastly, or not lastly, but one of the things you mentioned too is you're doing a lot of writing. Is there anything particularly interesting to you, other than processes, other than development, that you're researching, thinking about these days?
Development history is super short, right? Development firms don't stay around for very long for various reasons. There's a very short historical memory on development. And if you look at the sorts of buildings that were being made even 100 years ago, they were almost unrecognizable. When a lot of the things that raise costs and add complexity right now, like this building we're sitting in, they were just not at all a part of the equation. And so as I look at those, and am very interested in particular in unsubsidized affordable housing, where you're not using, $15 million of subsidy, which can be gone. A budget can change and you don't have that anymore. And what you're often dealing with there is this question for everybody: should I, as a developer, provide what people want but can't afford, or should I provide what they can afford but don't want? And the reason that that's so acute is people have no idea that we need twice as much land now because of the parking. And there didn't used to be appliances and MEP and all this. That has raised the cost to house people to an unspeakable level. And when people used to come here, they didn't get a 2-bed, they got a room. And, I've modeled buildings that were built in London in like the 1850s. They had like 150 square feet a person. But it was affordable, but does anybody want that now? And so I'm very interested in CoLiving, and most CoLiving firms fail. If you actually, there's headlines, and then you're like, well, what's happening with that firm now? And like the website, it's 404 error, like this company doesn't exist anymore. It's usually because they were offering housing that was too expensive, and that's usually because they were not being aggressive enough, honestly. But then you try to offer something that does everything everybody wants. Like, you don't need subsidy, and it's market, but it's nice, it's new. You run into what I call the ugly 2-bed problem of affordability. And that is that, if you go into any given market in the US and you say, if I go get an ugly 2-bed, and believe me, I've lived in ugly 2-beds, so no shame, but if you find some ugly 2-bed from the 60s or 50s or whatever it's from, you say, what's the rent on this? What is it in Raleigh? Like $900 or $1,000? Maybe it's less. If you go out a bit, maybe you can get an ugly 2-bed for $850. Okay. So now I want to do new construction, however small, however cheap, and I want you to pay $700. Well, why don't you just go get a roommate and split the ugly 2-bed? What would convince you to go into this thing? And conversely, if I say, no, I'm going to stay with you on price, how do I build something for $425 a month, new construction? I just find that to be the most challenging and perplexing problem, and I don't think it's something that a lot of people are interested in. I guess it just seems like a unsolvable problem, but I'm very fascinated by that.
Well, I think the problem of housing people has existed since the beginning, and again, you used to have rooming houses, and we used to have, all sorts of other solutions that, you didn't have all of your own appliances. You didn't have your own bathroom, right?
Well, there weren't appliances.
It's true, right? So there was no air conditioning. You didn't have the plenum. It wasn't a problem. And again, I think you could see a world where that, as a solution, kind of forces its way back onto the page. There's only so many potential outcomes and solutions in the space realm, and so it's interesting to me, though, that we have kind of forced ourselves away from certain things, and but we're not trying to solve a very new problem.
Well, one of my theses is that the T word, tenement, which they're all preserved now in New York, but there's a certain floor plan where people are sharing space kind of in a aggressive way, was caught at the scene of the crime at a time when there were no building codes, when there were no ventilation requirements, when whatever, right? Acute sanitary problems. But it's not those plans per se, or it's not the idea that you can devise a plan that works. And we've had a lot of years of plenty. But I can say that I lived in CoLiving in Germany that was like, man, if it was from the 60s, but it was fascinating. And so I'm fingers crossed hopeful that there will come a time here when it will be both seen for what it is as a huge solution to problems on the public side, seen for what it is as a affordable and also communally friendly way to live on the consumer side.
Yep.
And seen as something that is a viable investment on the financial and development side. So that's a personal, I say personal, it's a work-related personal research interest.
Well, and again, I think hopefully part of having these conversations is getting people exposed to different ideas and maybe bringing back up ideas that have been around for a while that don't get talked about. Because again, I think the problems are not unique. The solutions are not necessarily unique, but we are still struggling with housing.
That's right.
So lastly, I guess kind of to wrap things up, is there anything that we should have talked about but didn't? Is there anything that we kind of skipped over, glanced over that you want to circle back to?
No, I think this was, it's hard for me to judge. I've just been talking the whole time. But I certainly enjoyed it. I think this is a great chat. I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, it's easy, I think, in all of this to work, study. And in thinking through the last year and a half plus with COVID, I mentioned, I've had a number of different losses in the family. And I guess even as we're all writing, working, studying hard, I guess slightly cliche, but it's hard for me not to look at some of the things, what the nation's been through and also my own family has been through with some of these experiences, and just say, like, take the day off and don't, it's interesting you asked that, like, what are you interested in outside of real estate? And I give you a real estate answer, right? Because these things are interesting, they become all encompassing, but I think our lives are better, and actually what we do is better to the extent that we can actually unplug and get away from it. So I guess that would be the only parting word I would have, but extremely flattered to have had the chance to chat, and look forward to crossing paths with you and whoever was patient enough to listen to this whole thing in the future.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ben Stevens as much as I did. I can't recommend his book enough. Birth of a Building really is a fantastic read for anybody who is interested in the development process, who wants to understand more. And like we mentioned in the conversation, you may not be a developer, you may never be a developer, you may never be responsible for a project, but at some point in almost everyone's lives, there's going to come a time when knowing more about the process and the ins and outs of development will come in handy. And so again, I can't recommend The Birth of a Building more. I think it's a fantastic book, and I think you should get your hands on a copy as soon as possible. As always, I'm so grateful that you have chosen to share this time with me. If you ever have any questions about Dirt NC or any land use related issues, you can reach out to me on Twitter at OakCityCRE. Also, if you're looking for a simple and straight to the point weekly update on commercial development in Raleigh, you can subscribe to my newsletter at www.oakcitycre.com. Until next time, thank you.